people will watch this story and say crypto real estate doesn't work. I don't necessarily think that that's the correct conclusion because traditional landlords screw up properties too. REITs can mismanage properties. Private equity can mismanage properties. Mom and pop landlords can mismanage properties, right? Government owned housing can be mismanaged. I see it all the time. Nonprofits can mismanage properties as well, right? The technology isn't the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is whether the ownership model provides enough capital, accountability, and operational capacity to maintain the physical asset. And scale magnifies mistakes, right? If you own 3 houses and your property management system sucks, you have 3 problems, right? If you own 700 properties and your property management system sucks, you've created municipal policy, right? That's the difference. So apparently we've reached the point in Detroit real estate where a building can have multiple owners scattered all over the world and somehow nobody can keep the front door closed, right? Think about that. We've spent years hearing about how technology was going to revolutionize real estate, fractional ownership, blockchain, tokenization, global investors, democratizing access to real estate, passive income, weekly distributions, all these sophisticated financial terms. Meanwhile, residents in Detroit's Yorkshire Woods neighborhood are basically saying, hey, that's cool, but can somebody please come board up this abandoned building? And that is what makes the story that we're covering today so fascinating, because on the surface, this is a story about squatters occupying a vacant apartment building on Detroit's east side. But underneath that, this is actually a story about something a lot bigger. It's about what happens when the financialization of real estate moves faster than the actual management of real estate. It's about absentee ownership. It's about speculative investment. It's about Detroit's long history with distressed properties. It's about what happens when ownership becomes extremely sophisticated, but operations don't. And perhaps most importantly, who is ultimately responsible when a private real estate investment fails, but the consequences spill into an entire neighborhood because the investors might lose money, the company might fail, the lenders might take a haircut, but the people living next door, they don't get to diversify that risk, right? They live there. So let's talk about what's happening in Yorkshire Woods, and more importantly, how one vacant apartment building can become a neighborhood problem surprisingly fast.
It's a vacant apartment building that some neighbors say has become a hot spot for squatters. And the problems around that place are becoming such a nuisance. People living nearby say they're no longer feeling safe. Squatting, drugs, prostitution, and other illegal activity are just part of the problems, according to neighbors. Good evening, everybody. I'm Karen Drew. They say it's happening at a building on Cadieux near I-94.
Yeah, and I'm Devon Fernandez. You know, neighbors contacted us saying they're fed up. They say the city and police have been out to the property, but the problems continue. Take a look. For neighbors like Sterling Dickerson,
they overrun our neighborhood.
He says he feels like his east side community, Yorkshire Woods, is under siege.
This constant squatting and the people that's harassing us, the drug use is amazing over here.
Shout out the community members here who are brave enough to get in front of a camera and let it be known that they are not happy with this activity happening right next door, right? They got family, people in the community have children walking past this facility. And so they want a safe neighborhood, and they don't want people outside doing drugs and who knows what else, right? And so at the end of the day, this is a bit of a risk that the community takes when it comes to calling out this behavior, because that potentially could make them a target. And people understand what I'm talking about with regard to that statement. But at the end of the day, these people are fed up. They're putting their foot down and they're saying, hey, look, get the heck out of our neighborhood. Shout out to the gentleman on camera for actually giving a damn.
He's pointing to unauthorized traffic coming in and out of 10030 Cadieux. It's an abandoned apartment building that should be boarded up.
This is a nuisance. The neighborhood is being overrun, and the city should do something about this one apartment building.
Dickerson says the nuisance activity here happens all day, with problems spreading to other vacant properties nearby. He's captured this video of police conducting a raid just a few days ago.
We are so frustrated over here. It's like, I'm talking to you today for that, because of this.
So that sentence might actually be one of the most important sentences in the entire report, right? Spreading to other vacant properties nearby, because that's how neighborhood deterioration can compound. One unsecured property creates activity. Then another vacant house gets discovered. Then another, right? Pretty soon you don't just have a vacant building problem, you have a vacancy network. And Detroit has historical experience when it comes to this exact problem. From 2005 to 2015, approximately 120,000 residential properties in Detroit, nearly half of the city's residential properties experienced mortgage or tax foreclosure. Think about that. 120,000 properties, right? We talk about that in our other videos that I'm hoping that you've had an opportunity to catch, right? Research on Detroit's foreclosure crisis found that large numbers of properties eventually moved through speculative or bulk ownership structures. Some were neglected, some went through repeated foreclosure, some were eventually demolished at public expense. So when people ask, how does one building become a neighborhood problem? Detroit has already lived through the extreme version of that experiment. Now, I want to be very careful with how I say this next point here, and that is buying distressed property is not inherently bad, right? Investors are absolutely necessary for neighborhood recovery. Somebody has to take the risk of purchasing abandoned houses and buildings and renovating them, right? Somebody has to finance that renovation, right? Somebody has to hire contractors. Somebody has to put buildings back into productive use. The problem isn't investment. The problem is investment without sufficient operational capacity.
Local 4's Learn 10030 Cadieux has been on the city's radar for some time. It's among properties owned by the controversial group RealToken.
And there it is, ladies and gents, RealToken, right? If you've watched Flux City in the past, that name probably sounds familiar because this is not the first RealT story featured on this channel. This isn't simply random landlord has one problematic building. Detroit actually sued RealT in 2025 over more than 400 properties alleging widespread code violations and unsafe conditions. And by 2026, an outside fiduciary had been put in control of roughly 700 Detroit properties connected to the portfolio. When a distressed real estate portfolio becomes dysfunctional enough, a court can essentially put another party in control of those assets. The outside fiduciary overseeing RealT's Detroit portfolio has broad authority that includes managing properties, directing renovations, selling assets to generate cash, and potentially demolishing buildings deemed too dangerous or uneconomical to save, right? That's extraordinary because we're basically saying the ownership structure became so dysfunctional that someone else had to be given control of the real estate. Now, here's the challenge, right? Taking control of a distressed portfolio doesn't magically create money. You still need contractors, maintenance staff, property managers, security, insurance, tax payments, utilities, legal counsel, inspectors, permits, capital expenditures, and operating cash, right? And when we're talking about hundreds of scattered properties, that's an enormous operational undertaking. This is where I think the RealT story becomes an incredible case study for the entire real estate industry because the technological idea wasn't necessarily crazy. Tokenization basically means representing an economic interest in an asset digitally, right? Imagine a rental property worth $100,000, and instead of one person putting up $100,000, you create thousands of smaller investment interests. The theory is that this lowers the barrier to entry, right? Instead of needing $50,000 or $100,000 or qualifying for a mortgage even, somebody could potentially get exposure to real estate for a much smaller amount. That sounds attractive, right? But here's the problem. You can tokenize the ownership. You cannot tokenize the broken furnace. You cannot put a leaking roof on a blockchain, right? You cannot send a smart contract to snake a sewer line. You cannot replace a hot water tank with cryptocurrency. Maybe you could actually. And you definitely cannot tell a squatter, excuse me, sir, according to Ethereum, you're trespassing. According to this DAO we set up, you have to leave, right? Real estate remains stubbornly physical, right? Someone still has to show up. And I think that's the lesson. Now, here's where I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective, right? People will watch this story and say crypto real estate doesn't work. I don't necessarily think that that's the correct conclusion because traditional landlords screw up properties too. REITs can mismanage properties. Private equity can mismanage properties. Mom and pop landlords can mismanage properties, right? Government owned housing can be mismanaged. I see it all the time. Nonprofits can mismanage properties as well, right? The technology isn't the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is whether the ownership model provides enough capital, accountability, and operational capacity to maintain the physical asset. And scale magnifies mistakes, right? If you own 3 houses and your property management system sucks, you have 3 problems, right? If you own 700 properties and your property management system sucks, you've created municipal policy, right? That's the difference.
This property has been boarded up, as you can see, at least 3 times. We've had DPD out here
3 times, right? This is where we need to talk about the difference between securing a building and solving the underlying problem, because boarding up a building is basically emergency stabilization. It says we need to keep people out, but plywood doesn't create occupancy. It doesn't renovate apartments. It doesn't create cash flow. It doesn't install HVAC, right? It doesn't bring a building into compliance. Plywood buys time, right? And if people repeatedly remove these boards, now you're spending money repeatedly treating the symptom. Here's my developer brain kicking in. Every dollar spent repeatedly securing a building is a dollar that isn't necessarily going toward making the building productive again. So security is necessary, but security isn't the end game. Occupancy is the end game.
Detroit Corporation Counsel Conrad Mallett says the nuisance owner of hundreds of properties across the city is currently under court-ordered receivership.
Securing the buildings with plywood does not seem to be effective. We are probably going to have to upgrade securitization to the point where we're using something called Clearview or maybe even steel grating in order to keep people out of unsafe buildings.
On Monday, building inspectors posted notices to vacate around the site as staff prepares to once again secure the building. The District 4 Council member is also weighing in.
It's important for us to hold the owners of the properties accountable, but at the end of the day, we have to get these properties occupied. A vacant property of any sort is no good for the community.
Shout out to Councilwoman Letitia Johnson. She's been very aggressive at getting District 4 to a point where it has new development, aligning the commercial corridors and the neighborhoods. She's doing her best, right? She's working really, really hard for the people, in my opinion. And I'm a big fan of what she's been able to accomplish up to this point. And I absolutely agree with what she said, right? She said it is important for us to hold the owners of these properties accountable, but at the end of the day, we have to get these properties occupied. And so this is where I think the conversation gets a little bit more complex, because punishment alone doesn't rehabilitate real estate. Fine the owner, absolutely. Enforce the code, absolutely. Take negligent owners to court, absolutely. But eventually somebody still has to answer the most important question, right? What happens to the building? This building has strong bones, right? Has a ton of potential to be able to house, families really, really wanting to see something where this property eventually has an opportunity to get back online. And a $10,000 fine doesn't necessarily fix the roof, right? A lawsuit doesn't replace plumbing. A press conference doesn't renovate apartments. Eventually, someone needs a viable capital stack and redevelopment plan to make a project like this pencil and get to a point where it's servicing the community the proper way.
Now, Detroit's Law Department and the council staff are urging residents dealing with problem properties to continue reporting those issues to the city. They say that helps the Law Department build a case against public nuisances. Also, the Department of Neighborhoods is hosting a meeting right now at Heilman Rec Center for residents in District 3 and 4. I'm told staff from several departments will be available to talk about issues, including walking you through using the improved Detroit app. That meeting ends at 7 tonight.
RealT talked about democratizing access to real estate investment. And conceptually, I actually like the idea. Real estate ownership historically requires significant capital, right? So lowering the barrier to participation could be valuable. But here's the irony. If you're going to democratize real estate investment, you also have to democratize accountability. You can't distribute the upside globally while concentrating the consequences locally. That's a philosophical problem this story exposes. So when I look at that apartment building in Yorkshire Woods, I don't just see squatters, right? I see the end result of a much bigger chain. Detroit loses population, properties decline in value, foreclosures explode, investors discover cheaper real estate, properties get bundled, right? Ownership becomes increasingly distant. Technology makes investment easier, capital moves a bit faster, portfolios can get a bit bigger, but operations struggle to keep up, right? Maintenance gets deferred, properties become distressed, and eventually the neighbor next door is calling the news asking somebody to secure the building. That's the full story. And that's why real estate is never just about buying property. Ownership is responsibility. Whether you own one duplex, 100 houses, 700 properties, or 1/10,000th of a tokenized apartment building, somebody still has to take responsibility for the physical asset. And maybe that's the biggest lesson from the RealT experiment. Technology can change how we finance real estate. It can change how ownership interests are divided. It can change how investors move money around the world. But technology has not changed the fundamental rules of property ownership. Roofs still leak, furnaces still break, tenants still need repairs, vacant buildings still need security, and neighborhoods still suffer when owners fail. So here are a number of questions I want you guys to consider. Should Detroit use this RealT collapse as an opportunity to fundamentally rethink how large distressed property portfolios are sold? Should tenants get first shot? Should developers get preference? Local developers, more specifically, should the city prevent another investor from simply buying hundreds of these properties all at once? Should some buildings be demolished? Should nonprofits acquire a few of these properties that RealT has, right? Or should Detroit simply just let the market determine where these properties end up? Because whatever happens next, Detroit should probably make sure we don't end up doing this exact same episode 5 years from now. Drop your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you live anywhere near Yorkshire Woods or near another RealT property, I'm especially interested in hearing what you've actually seen on the ground, because this story isn't really about cryptocurrency, right? It's not even really about squatters. It's about what ownership means when the owner becomes increasingly disconnected from the place being owned. And that's a much bigger conversation, right? This is Flux City, and I'll see you in the next video.